It's known as superacid, vitamin K, and special K.
Ketamine therapy is quickly gaining popularity for treatment-resistant mental health disorders.
You have to do K at least 500 times before you even start to understand it.
What exactly is ketamine?
Let's talk about drugs, maybe. Let's talk about PCP. Let's talk about all the good things and the bad things. Ketamine. Let's talk about drugs. Let's talk about drugs. Let's talk about drugs. Let's talk about drugs.
Ketamine. Everyone's favorite anesthetic, but now with fun psychiatric flair. This interesting drug has only been around since the 60s, but it's made waves. First as a handy battlefield treatment, and later as a party drug. Now it's the talk of the town as a powerful new antidepressant. But does it live up to the hype? This video was sponsored by Brilliant. Ketamine is actually on the younger end when it comes to popular psychedelic drugs. Psilocybin mushrooms appear in cave paintings. Peyote has been used in indigenous cultures for over 5,000 years. Mescaline was isolated in 1897. MDMA was created in 1912, and LSD was discovered in 1938. But ketamine wasn't synthesized until 1962 by a chemistry professor named Calvin L. Stevens, who was consulting for a company called Parke-Davis. The company was looking for an alternative to phencyclidine, better known as PCP. Yes, that PCP.
The chemical PCP, or angel dust.
An hallucinogenic drug, popular particularly with the young.
Producing a floating euphoric high.
The most dangerous new drug fad among the nation's youth.
PCP was created as an anesthetic, which, if you're not familiar with the term, is a substance that's used to prevent pain during medical procedures by causing a loss of sensation or consciousness. Now, PCP worked pretty well, but it had the unfortunate side effect of causing emergence delirium, which is just a fancy way of saying that it made people feel wildly high. They'd hallucinate, behave irrationally, and sometimes experience psychosis. All those traits made it less than ideal for medical purposes. So, scientists started playing around with structural analogs, and eventually, CI-581, later called ketamine, was born. The first tests in humans were done on prisoner volunteers, and ketamine was found to be an effective anesthesia. It had a short duration of action, with the effects generally lasting between 30 and 60 minutes, and it induced a dreamlike state. People who had been dosed with ketamine appeared to be awake, but they were basically unresponsive to the people around them. The researchers noted how subjects seemed disconnected from their surroundings, which ended up prompting the wife of one of the scientists to suggest calling ketamine a dissociative anesthetic. The drug was approved for use in humans in 1970, and it was used heavily as an anesthetic during the Vietnam War. Under the brand name Ketalar, ketamine was a valuable tool as a combat medication because, unlike most other anesthetics, it didn't really have a huge impact on a person's breathing or their heart rate. So, it was harder to accidentally kill someone you were trying to treat on the battlefield. As a bonus, in addition to working as an anesthesia, ketamine has a bit of an analgesic effect, meaning that it reduces your perception of pain, which would obviously make it helpful in combat situations. But medics noted that, in addition to these desired effects, it also had a psychedelic or euphoric influence on patients. And since we're not allowed to have any fun, and because scientists developed other anesthetic options like propofol that didn't get you the fun kind of high, ketamine ended up falling out of favor for medical use. With time, however, ketamine started to become more popular for recreational use, and it became a club drug in rave culture, particularly in the 1980s. Man, people did a lot of drugs in the 80s. This is where it picked up all sorts of fun nicknames. Vitamin K, Special K, Kit Kat. Ketamine also became more popular in veterinary science, where it remains a commonly used anesthetic today. In fact, in grad school, I used to use ketamine mixed with some other drugs for anesthetizing mice in the course of my research. But of course, what's old is new again. In the 90s, despite the challenges around using ketamine as an anesthesia, oh my gosh. Cicada in my pants. I can't record this video because there's cicadas crawling up my pants. Next time I'm going to wear leggings. But of course, what's old is new again. In the 90s, despite the challenges around using ketamine as an anesthesia and its somewhat blemished reputation as a party drug, there was a renewed interest in the drug for its potential pain-killing effects, particularly for treating opioid-induced hyperalgesia, which is when someone who takes opioids becomes more sensitive to pain instead of less. Other drugs were also developed around this time that could be co-administered with ketamine so that it didn't have such a strong psychedelic effect when patients were waking up from their medical procedures, which made it a more palatable option again. But in the last decade or so, ketamine research, ketamine popularity, and a whole new sector of startup ketamine companies have popped off. Why? Well, because it turns out that ketamine makes a pretty effective treatment for depression.
Doctors are finding great success with ketamine.
It's one of the newest legal forms of medication to treat depression.
This area of psychiatry under the umbrella of psychedelics is really exploding.
Clinics are now using ketamine in combination with psychotherapy to treat a variety of mental health conditions.
And while researchers have been studying its potential antidepressant effects since the 1970s, this recent tidal wave of research led the U.S. Food and Drug Administration to approve a form of ketamine called S-ketamine for treating treatment-resistant depression in 2019. And now it's so commonplace that you can get targeted ads on Instagram or TikTok or even YouTube from companies that want to mail you a box of ketamine so you can treat yourself at home. I wouldn't be surprised if you even got one on this video. So, how did we get here? How did ketamine go from being a party drug to being a miracle cure? Well, first, let's talk about what we know about depression in the brain. For a long time, the predominant theory about depression was the monoamine theory, which basically says that depression is caused by inadequate monoamine signaling. Monoamines include well-known neurotransmitters like serotonin, noradrenaline, and dopamine. Now, the evidence for this theory isn't terrible, but it's not great either. Still, it was good enough for the entire medical establishment to decide that drugs that can increase monoamine signaling should be the first choice for antidepressants. Think SSRIs, SNRIs, MAOIs, and so on. In more recent years, a variety of other theories have been floated, including a possible relationship between immune system activity and depression, and a theory that blames abnormalities in the HPA axis neuroendocrine system, which is a system that controls your reactions to stress. I'm not gonna dive into those theories right now, but they're definitely worth checking out if you're interested in this sort of thing. Anyway, in the 1990s, another theory came along, which is the one we're interested in today. It proposed that depression is the result of dysfunction in the glutamate system. Glutamate is the main excitatory neurotransmitter in the brain. So, anything that affects glutamate signaling has the potential to affect a lot of what's going on in there. In particular, scientists believe that the N-methyl D-aspartate, or NMDA receptor, might be important in depression. These receptors are ligand-gated ion channels, meaning that the channel opens up to allow ion exchange to occur when the right ligand, such as a neurotransmitter, binds to the receptor. NMDA receptors respond to glutamate and are a major component of the brain's excitatory neurotransmission. They also play a large part in synaptic plasticity, which is quite widely believed to be the biological mechanism underlying learning and memory formation. NMDA receptors are found throughout the brain and have been implicated in a wide variety of neurological and psychiatric disorders. Everything from Alzheimer's disease to epilepsy to strokes to mood disorders. Researchers got interested in NMDA receptors in depression because of behavioral studies showing that if you gave mice drugs that antagonized or blocked NMDA receptors, it mimicked the effects of antidepressants. Further research found that antidepressants affect NMDA receptor function, and they can lead to changes in the expression of mRNA that encodes some NMDA receptor subunits. Now, I know that this might all sound like gobbledygook for some of you, but all you really need to understand is that changes in how these receptors work could explain the mood changes we see in depression, and certain drugs that adjust the way those receptors function seem to reduce depression symptoms. And so ketamine became an interesting target because of what we know about how ketamine works in the brain. Now, like basically all of the drugs I've talked about in past videos, we're not 100% sure how ketamine works. Most anesthetics act by modulating GABA transmission to knock us out. GABA is a chemical in the brain that helps to calm down or inhibit nerve signals. You could think of it sort of like a brake pedal that helps to reduce activity in the nervous system, which can make you feel more relaxed and less anxious, and also knocks you out. But ketamine doesn't act on GABA transmission. Instead, it seems to reduce excitatory signaling by antagonizing NMDA, preventing it from binding to its receptors. This is thought to have a cascading effect that leads to dissociative anesthesia, amnesia, and inhibited sensory perception. But not only NMDA receptors are affected. Ketamine also appears to act on a wide variety of targets in the brain and body, and different targets seem to be linked to different effects. It seems to have an analgesic effect because of its interactions with opioid receptors and voltage-gated sodium channels. Its hypnotic effect may be a result of its interactions with something called the hyperpolarization activated cyclic nucleotide, or HCN channel. Been a neuroscientist for like 15 years and I'd never heard of those before. I guess you really do learn something new every day. But anyway, back to my main point, which is ketamine affects NMDA receptor function. And the link between NMDA activity and depression was strong enough for scientists to consider ketamine as a possible antidepressant option. And the nice thing about ketamine versus most of the other drugs we've explored here on the channel is that it is not a Schedule I substance. Now, I'm not gonna do a deep dive on the drug scheduling system in this video. Micah already did that a couple years ago, and you can check it out at the link down below. But for our purposes, here's what you need to know. Many of the drugs we've talked about, like LSD, shrooms, cannabis, and MDMA, are Schedule I drugs, meaning that they are considered to have high abuse potential and no currently accepted medical use. Doing research with Schedule I drugs is really challenging because researchers have to jump through a million hoops to get access to the drugs themselves in order to study them, because those drugs are so heavily controlled. Ketamine, on the other hand, is a Schedule III drug, which means that it has an accepted medical use. In this case, its use as an anesthetic. And it's considered to have a moderate to low potential for physical and psychological dependence. For reference, testosterone, anabolic steroids, and Tylenol with codeine are also Schedule III drugs. So while it's illegal to have ketamine without a prescription, it is a lot easier for researchers and clinicians to get approval and access to ketamine for research purposes compared to, let's say, MDMA. So, in 2000, based on the fact that NMDA receptors had been implicated in depression, and the fact that ketamine is an NMDA receptor antagonist, Robert Berman and his team of 6 other researchers went ahead and conducted a small clinical trial with ketamine, just 7 patients. And within hours of a single sub-anesthetic dose of ketamine, most of the patients experienced a dramatic improvement in their depressive symptoms. Since then, repeated larger trials found more of the same. Within hours, severely depressed patients treated with ketamine experienced significant improvements in their symptoms, with the effects lasting up to 2 weeks. Ketamine treatment has also been found to help reduce suicidal ideation and anhedonia, both common symptoms of severe treatment-resistant depression. After almost 2 decades of additional research, the FDA approved Spravato, an intranasal spray containing a form of ketamine, as a therapy for individuals diagnosed with major depression that hadn't responded to 2 or more traditional antidepressants. And scientists have been working on better understanding how ketamine produces this effect and how to best apply this treatment ever since. When a person takes ketamine, a bunch of stuff happens. When used recreationally, which usually involves insufflation or snorting the drug, effects typically kick in pretty fast, within about 5 to 20 minutes, and it has a relatively short high of about 30 minutes to an hour. Ketamine raises blood pressure and heart rate, and at a high dose, of course, it acts as a dissociative anesthetic, rendering a person essentially unconscious for the duration of their treatment. Now, at lower, sub-anesthetic doses, it can have a number of psychological effects, including feelings of intoxication, changes in visual and auditory perception, delusions and hallucinations, and difficulty speaking and moving. People who take ketamine recreationally describe it as euphoric, dreamlike, relaxed, and chill. I've heard people say that it can be buzzy or sparkly. The side effects can include feeling confused, disoriented, and nauseated. It can also dull your sense of pain, making it hard for you to tell if you've injured yourself. Sometimes, if a person using ketamine takes too much, they can fall into a K-hole, which means that they become unable to interact with the world around them because they've taken so much ketamine. And while ketamine has less of an effect on the cardiac and lung functions than many other anesthetics, you can fatally overdose on it. Heavy, long-term ketamine use is associated with all kinds of nasty things like bladder and urinary problems, abdominal cramps, and liver damage. Regular use is also associated with memory problems, depression, ironically, and occasionally psychotic symptoms. So the drug is not without its risks, especially if it's abused. Ketamine exists as an equal mixture of its two enantiomers. That just means that they're non-superimposable mirror images of each other, sort of like your right and left hand. I don't want to get into it too much because it's pretty complicated, and mostly because I barely passed organic chemistry. But basically, you just need to know ketamine has the R and S enantiomers. Studies looking at both of the enantiomers have found that the S enantiomer, called S-ketamine, is a more potent NMDA receptor antagonist than R-ketamine. S-ketamine is the form of ketamine that was approved by the FDA in 2019. Now, on the other hand, animal studies have indicated that R-ketamine might have a better antidepressant effect, and it may have fewer or more tolerable side effects. So there are now more ongoing studies looking at whether R-ketamine might be an even better treatment than S-ketamine. However, it's worth noting that R-ketamine also seems to produce more of the psychedelic effects associated with the drug, which might make it harder to get it approved because you can't have any fun. Basically, everyone is trying to figure out a way to make ketamine have a stronger antidepressant effect while having a reduced dissociative or psychedelic effect. Scientists are exploring whether some of the metabolites of ketamine, which are just the different compounds that it gets broken down into in your body, might also have antidepressant effects. That research has shown some mixed success. Researchers are also exploring possible applications in other mental health disorders, such as bipolar disorder, PTSD, anxiety, and substance use disorders. And while it's not necessarily mental health related, ketamine is sometimes prescribed off-label for pain management among people with burns, migraines, cancer pain, and other types of chronic pain. Other research is digging further into the neurophysiology of the drug. Some studies have found that ketamine might impact even more receptors than we originally thought, possibly including alpha-amino 3-hydroxy-5-methyl-4-isoxazole propionic acid, or AMPA receptors, which are another major player in excitatory neurotransmission. And there are studies indicating that ketamine may exert its antidepressant effects by increasing the levels of proteins like BDNF and mTOR, both of which are critical proteins for neuronal survival and growth, and both are linked to important processes like synaptic plasticity and cellular metabolism. fMRI studies have found that ketamine use causes changes in functional connectivity between different brain regions, like the subgenual anterior cingulate cortex, which is involved in mood modulation, and a cluster of brain regions including the thalamus, hippocampus, and retrosplenial cortex, which indicates that ketamine's effects on the brain's network connectivity may be why it has such a strong, rapid antidepressant effect. The general theory is that ketamine may induce neuroplasticity, giving your brain a chance to break out of the signaling patterns that contribute to feelings of depression and anxiety, and giving you the chance to rewire new connections that help you develop more feelings of positivity and optimism. And the research just keeps going. I got dizzy looking at all the papers and citations out there on this stuff. Honestly, after finding so little about drugs like LSD and MDMA, it's been pretty refreshing. At any rate, our understanding of the drug and its use in treating anxiety and depression has proliferated. There's the FDA-approved nasal spray. There are also ketamine clinics where patients can receive IV infusions of the drug. And of course, like I mentioned, there are a bunch of options for at-home ketamine therapy, which typically use sublingual pills, the kind you dissolve under your tongue. I had kind of a hard time figuring out how we went from approval of a nasal spray in 2019 to targeted ads for at-home ketamine pills in 2024. From what I can tell, this seems to go back to the fact that the FDA loosened rules around telemedicine and prescribing certain medications during the COVID-19 pandemic, when it became, obviously, quite challenging for people to meet their healthcare providers in person. These regulation changes included allowing providers to mail controlled substances, such as ketamine, across state lines. This allowed companies, some of whom had already been operating in-person clinics, to mail a treatment kit and set patients up with a telehealth provider to walk them through using the ketamine therapy. And man, a lot of new companies exist today because of it. Most of these treatments involve an introduction call with a specialized therapist or coach who walks you through the treatment and what to expect, followed by a pre-session call where your provider guides you through the medication administration process before you lay down and just let the drug do its thing. Usually, you're required to have an in-person sitter with you to keep an eye on you during your treatment, just to make sure that nothing goes wrong. And then afterward, you'll have a call with your provider to talk through the experience and digest it. This after-treatment discussion is meant to help integrate the experience and help things stick by shaping those new neural pathways. So far, the business is booming, though opinions are mixed on its utility and safety. A clinical trial published in 2022 looked at the data provided by over 1,200 people who had participated in at-home ketamine therapy. The study found that more than half of those people reported at least a 50% improvement in their depression or anxiety symptoms, with about a third of them reporting remission. And only 6 people dropped out of treatment due to side effects or adverse events, which sounds pretty good, right? But there have also been pretty concerning case reports of people ending up hospitalized because of accidentally taking their ketamine dose incorrectly. And a report released by All Points North, a health center specializing in addictions treatment, surveyed 2,000 people and claimed that more than half of them had shared that they either accidentally or deliberately used more than the recommended dose. That said, this report is based on a survey conducted by a market research consultant group that was hired by All Points North. And since that organization specializes in addictions treatment, I would probably take those results with a grain of salt, at least until more data is available. In 2023, the FDA released a warning for patients and healthcare providers regarding at-home ketamine, reminding the public that ketamine is not FDA approved for treating psychiatric disorders. Only S-ketamine is. And the drug comes with very real risks. See those case studies I mentioned. And like many substances, ketamine can be addictive. People don't take it recreationally for nothing. It's known to make you feel happy and relaxed. Sometimes that leads people to take more of it more often or for longer than they should, which can lead to some of those other serious issues I talked about earlier. So just because you can get it at home doesn't mean the drug is totally safe. I think of it like other potentially dangerous prescription drugs, like opioid painkillers. Ketamine appears to be potent and useful for treating these mental health issues, but it also has serious potential side effects and downsides. Patients and their doctors need to weigh both the benefits and the risks when making the decision to pursue a treatment, like ketamine. Now, as I mentioned, only S-ketamine, in the form of an intranasal spray, is approved by the FDA for treating depression. That means that when it's prescribed as a pill, it's considered off-label. Now, doctors are totally allowed to prescribe drugs off-label. The FDA doesn't regulate off-label prescriptions, and the law generally leaves it up to clinicians to decide what treatments are medically appropriate for their patients. One common example would be prescribing a beta blocker for treating anxiety, when they're actually FDA approved for treating blood pressure and heart rhythm issues. Heck, I've taken an off-label drug before. When I was struggling with insomnia, my doctor prescribed trazodone, which is approved for treating depression, but it also makes you really sleepy. So generally, it's pretty chill to take a drug off-label with a prescription. It just means that that drug hasn't been subjected to the same federal scrutiny for treating that condition. And, importantly, it can also mean that insurance won't cover it, because insurance companies think that you should be taking the FDA-approved drug, not the off-label one. So, while S-ketamine is covered by most major insurers with a prescription, at-home pill treatments often are not. So, even if you do think that at-home ketamine therapy is a good option for you, you might balk a little bit at the price tag. The treatments typically start at around $100 per at-home session, and they only go up in price from there. If you're looking at doing ketamine infusions in a clinic, the price tag is even higher, starting at around $1,000 per session. And since the treatment's effects only seem to last for a week or two, you'd typically want to do a series of treatments, say 4 to 8 sessions, spread over a couple of months. So if you don't have deep pockets, these services might be a bit of a stretch. Where does that leave us? Well, I think that, like so many things, it's a little complicated. It's clear that for some people, these kinds of ketamine treatments are really valuable. I think the evidence that they can help with treatment-resistant depression is compelling. But I also understand why the proliferation of these services is concerning to some clinicians and policymakers. I can see how this kind of service could pretty easily result in someone who doesn't really need the treatment getting access to ketamine. These aren't tenured MDs at a large clinic or hospital prescribing these drugs. These are employees of a company whose entire existence relies on selling these medications. And I don't necessarily have a problem with that. In some ways, it reminds me of how cannabis was only available for medical use for a long time, and this was just a decade or so ago. And you could just spend 15 minutes on a video call with a doctor and get a medical card so you could legally buy weed. I'm generally a fan of letting people make their own decisions about their bodies, and I'm a fan of letting people work with their providers to decide how to address health issues. I don't even really care if people want to take ketamine recreationally. I think my main concern here is just ketamine is an anesthetic. You can physically overdose on it, even if it's less risky than other anesthetics. So it's really important that any company providing these services take whatever steps necessary to protect the safety and well-being of their clients. And people who use ketamine need to be aware of the risks, both short and long term. I also think that the cost of these treatments is a lesser problem, but it's still worth noting. At $100 or more a pop, only the wealthy can really access these resources. People of lower socioeconomic status already struggle to access adequate health care, and they often encounter biases and challenges within the standard medical system. It would be really nice if they had the opportunity to access some of these non-traditional routes of treatment too. I think that the proliferation of these services really speaks to shifting social norms around substance use. I've always found it a little bit baffling that our culture generally agreed that alcohol and nicotine, which are two extremely addictive and dangerous drugs, are totally chill for everyday use. But other substances, like cannabis and LSD, which are measurably safer and much less physically addictive, should be made illegal. Not to get all hippy-dippy about it, but I think there's some merit to the claims that many of these substances were outlawed not because of their risks, but because of their role in counterculture movements, and because of general societal fear that these drugs might result in more open thinking, free love, and reduced adherence to social norms. But in recent years, as scientists have started to better understand some of these substances, we're starting to see that perspective shift again. Now, we're not just seeing them as drugs designed to tear down society as we know it. We're understanding their utility as medicines. Ketamine pretty easily made the jump to being an accepted mental health treatment because it already had a common and accepted use as an anesthetic. And now, it's FDA approved for depression. Cannabis has had years of medical use to generate data on its relative safety and utility. And what was once a Schedule I drug, considered to be highly addictive with no medical use, is now slated to be rescheduled to Schedule III, the same level as ketamine. And the once vilified party drug, MDMA, a favorite of ravers, is currently being reviewed by the FDA for possible approval for treating PTSD this August, which would also change its schedule. We are in the early stages of a new era in mental health treatment. I don't know that psychedelic substances will necessarily remain the focus, but I think our growing knowledge around the underlying biology of these diseases and what is actually needed to address them will lead to dramatic improvements in patient care and treatment, including new and better medicines. And as a person with a mental illness, I think that's pretty exciting. Of course, medications aren't the only tool that I use to support my mental well-being. I also make sure to eat a relatively healthy diet, get regular exercise, spend lots of time with people I love, and make time to keep my brain engaged and learn new things. That's why I love Brilliant. It's a great way for me to learn something new every day. Brilliant is where you learn by doing. They have thousands of interactive lessons in math, data analysis, programming, and AI. They guide you through STEM topics from the ground up, making it really easy to learn new things and build on that knowledge. I'm a big fan of their hands-on problem solving, which is just a lot more fun and helps me build my critical thinking skills rather than just reading a textbook or something. And their courses are designed to help you build a daily learning habit. Like, you don't have to use it every day, you can take it at your own pace, but I love seeing my daily streak rack up, and it's easy to do whenever I have time. If you've been watching Neurotransmissions for a while, you're probably already familiar with Brilliant because they've been really good to us. But they're also regularly adding new content, so check them out if it's been a while. I'm especially excited about their new data content, which uses real-world data to help you see trends and make better informed decisions. I recently started a new job where I'm hoping to do some data analysis as part of my role, so I'm looking forward to learning more about how to do it effectively. Brilliant's also got a new course on LLMs, which is another thing I'm starting to use more in my current job. So much good stuff. Anyway, it would mean a lot to me if you tried them out. To check out these courses and many more for free for a full 30 days, visit brilliant.org/neurotransmissions or click the link in the description below. You'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription using that link, so be sure to check it out. Thanks. I'd really love to hear about your experience if you've tried ketamine therapy, or if you know someone who has. What did you think? And if you haven't done it yourself, would you ever consider it? I think I would. I'm lucky enough to be in a place where my mental health is pretty well managed, so it's not something I need right now. But if I'm struggling again in the future, I might check it out. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching this episode of Neurotransmissions. Until our next transmission, I'm Ali Astrocyte. Over and out.